Robin Ironside is the Australian's aviation writer, and she's joining me on what turned out to be a chaotic weekend for anyone who was trying to fly. In America, it's been Thanksgiving weekend, and a whole lot of families' plans have been thrown into chaos by the sudden grounding of thousands of aircraft made by the European manufacturer Airbus. Robin, what happened at airports around Australia and around the world on the weekend?
Well, this directive from Airbus went out late Friday that all Airbus A320 aircraft, and that was a variety of models from the A319, the A318, and the A321, as well as the A320, that they required this software update. That was about 5,100 aircraft worldwide, and another 900 of the older models actually needed a new onboard flight computer altogether. So that directive went out, and as a result, airlines had no choice but to ground those aircraft and carry out the update, which in Jetstar's case had to be carried out for 34 of its A320 aircraft, which took a considerable amount of time, given each of the software updates took about an hour to carry out.
A lot of these aircraft that were affected are single aisle kind of workhorse planes. What kind of routes are they flying in Australia?
Well, they fly predominantly domestic routes in Australia, and they also do some short haul international routes, say to Bali, to New Zealand, to Fiji. So those all of those routes were impacted by this directive.
So, what had precipitated this was a sudden loss in height on a JetBlue flight a couple of weeks earlier. Tell me about that. What had happened there?
Yes, the flight was going from Mexico to New Jersey, and shortly, probably about less than an hour into the flight, they experienced this uncommanded loss of altitude that was so sharp. A number of passengers were injured, had cuts and bruises. So the pilot elected to make an emergency landing at Tampa in Florida. And when they arrived, the aircraft was looked at, it was grounded until the Federal Aviation Administration and JetBlue carried out an investigation. In the course of this investigation, it was discovered that solar radiation had impacted a digital component in the onboard computer. And it just happened to be that digital component that affects the elevator and aileron of the aircraft, so affects its ability to go up and down.
The word uncommanded is absolutely terrifying, Robin. It must have been horrendous being on that plane.
It would have been, and particularly so for the pilots who wouldn't have really known what was happening. All of a sudden, it felt like the aircraft would have taken over, and it had suddenly started descending despite their best efforts to keep it on a steady course. So you can understand why they would have been keen to land as soon as possible.
Airbus A320s use something called fly-by-wire, which is the sophisticated computer, I guess, interface between the pilot and the parts of the plane that make it go up and down and make it go. Fly-by-wire is designed to almost soften a pilot's reactions to things. So to interpret what the pilot's doing or telling it to do, and then to make that happen. And it's designed to avoid any sudden changes or drops in altitude or anything like that. The fact that in this instance, the fly-by-wire system is what was operating the Airbus at the time that it suffered this, dive, it speaks to how sophisticated modern aeroplanes are, but it also speaks to the fact that the pilot sometimes doesn't actually have any control at all.
It's pretty terrifying when you think about it. And that, I guess, has been an ongoing criticism of Airbus aircraft, that they do rely so heavily on computers. Boeing, to an extent, still uses more of a manual operation. I've heard it described as, using pulleys and cables. I'm not quite sure that it's that basic. But the Airbus is very much the fly-by-wire model, where the pilot is almost secondary to the computers in some instances.
Is it possible that at some point in the future, as planes become more and more sophisticated, that there won't actually be human beings sitting in cockpits?
Well, that's certainly the case, and already Airbus is developing a freighter aircraft that will only require one pilot, and pilots themselves are very concerned about this move, but this particular freighter aircraft is very much in demand by airlines who see considerable financial benefits to it. They see that it's a safe aircraft because of the technology that's used, but how long it is before we move to that for commercial passenger aircraft is certainly a cause for concern within the pilot community and probably in the passenger community too.
Robin, why was it Airbus planes that were so strongly affected by this as opposed to the other manufacturers like Boeing?
Well, that's a good question. It sounds like it was a time and place issue. It has been described to me that solar radiation is high energy particles that collide with the Earth's atmosphere, generating a cascade of secondary particles, including neutrons, protons, ions, and photons. And in the context of avionics, neutrons are the primary concern. And in this instance, a neutron struck a digital component in the plane. So it's may have been a case of bad luck rather than something that would have happened more in a more widespread nature. That's my very layman's understanding of it anyway.
Yeah, my layman's understanding is that it does something potential if this happens, it can cause something called a bit flip, where a 0 and a 1 in a computing system are transposed and the computer gets confused. In an Airbus A320, there are at least 3 computers on board that are flying the plane, and they're supposed to be able to override an accident like this happening to one computer. It would suggest that the problem is bigger than Airbus could have possibly anticipated, right?
Indeed, and I guess that's why it's taken the action that it has to do its best to safeguard the computers in all other aircraft that perhaps didn't have this protection before, and to ensure that the chances of something like this happening again is very, very much minimized.
I'm hearing praise for Airbus for having taken action quickly and for having grounded planes, even turning planes around that were in the air at the time that the recall was announced. But what's your view, Robin, as someone who's covered aviation for a long time? Should we be praising Airbus here, or should we be concerned that Airbus had allowed itself to be in a situation where perhaps its computers were not properly protected from solar radiation?
I do think in this instance, they do deserve praise. I mean, we look back at the Boeing 737 MAX 8 episode where there was one fatal crash, and it was very much linked to this new system that Boeing had put on the plane without telling a lot of people. And that rather than taking action then, they waited until there was a second fatal crash before more action was taken to ground the aircraft and to rework, I guess, the computers on board so they didn't have this fault in them. So in that context, I think you have to praise Airbus for not mucking around, for sort of as soon as it realized what was the likely cause of this uncommanded drop in altitude for the JetBlue flight, it released the direction to pretty much ground most of the A320 fleet and make these corrections.
How do you think other manufacturers will be responding now? Will they also be looking at the hardening that their systems have from solar radiation, for example?
Within the airline community, there's always learnings taken from any sort of incident. So there would certainly other aviation companies such as Boeing and Embraer, they would be looking closely at this and making a decision as to whether they have to take action against their own onboard computers and software. The sort of computers we're talking about, that they're closely guarded secrets in the airline industry. So just exactly how the Airbus computers differ from others, we don't know, but that they would certainly be trying to take any lessons that could be learned from it.
This incident reminds me of other sort of sudden loss of altitude moments that have happened in the air in recent years. Do you think any of those might have been connected to a similar situation?
Well, I did wonder if they would go back and look at other episodes of sudden losses in altitude that didn't have an obvious explanation. often we put them down to clear air turbulence. So it will be interesting to see if they go back and review some of those instances through this lens.
You're a regular passenger as well as an aviation expert, Robin. Does knowing a lot about the way planes work and, and the safety of our skies make you a more nervous flyer or a less nervous flyer? And how do you behave on a plane with all of this in the back of your mind?
Well, it to an extent, it makes me more confident because I know that the chances of anything going wrong are greatly minimized in the air just because it does have such a safety first focus. But also knowing that takeoffs and landings are the highest risk phases of the flight makes me very nervous on landing, I have to say. I do get a bit anxious, until the plane actually, comes to a stop. But during the cruise flight, you the chances of anything going wrong are so small, that you're better off up there than you would be down on the road.
After the last story about a sudden loss of altitude, I now keep my seatbelt on the whole flight.
Very wise. I mean, that is a wise move, and this one is yet another example of that. Can only assume that the passengers injured weren't wearing seat belts, or maybe they were up walking around, and yeah, I'm sure it would be no fun, when something like this happens, to be thrown into the ceiling of a plane.
Will this be an inflection point, do you think, Robin, in the way we think about the computerization of flying and perhaps the measures that manufacturers and operators need to take to keep their aircraft safe?
It's hard to imagine them stepping back from computerization because it is such a integral part of aircraft manufacturing. So it's hard to imagine this would, and especially given the fact that there weren't any fatalities involved, there wasn't a hull loss. Makes me suspect that although it's being taken very seriously, it's not going to result in a dramatic change.
And would you be worried about getting on an Airbus A320 today, or would you think it's safer than it was last week?
Well, precisely. I would think it was safer than it was last week, given there's over 12,500 of these aircraft operating around the world. To have this reaction to something going wrong in one just shows you how, I guess, safety conscious and responsive the industry is to these sorts of events. So you'd like to think that it's only going to make them safer.
Robin Ironside is the Australian's aviation writer. Thanks, Robin.